Hey everybody. So I wanted to talk to you guys today about using evidence effectively, otherwise known as the STAR method. And as we get further into this semester, we're going to be using more and more types of writing that are going to require more and more evidence. This semester is all about argumentation. And you can't argue effectively if you don't have proof to back up what you're saying. Otherwise, it's just your word versus mine, and who's to say your word is better than mine, or vice versa? So, you know, you have to you have to keep that in mind that we're going to be using more and more evidence as we get deeper into more complicated types of writings. And so you need to be able to use evidence effectively, which is, as you can read on the slide here, what we're talking about. So I've broken this up into an acronym. And, or I shouldn't say I didn't create this, okay? I just find that it's very, very useful. So um, it's called the STAR method. And so what does that mean? STAR method is sufficiency, typicality, accuracy, and relevance. And I'm going to get into each one of those in just a minute. So when you're deciding on, is this evidence that I'm using or is this evidence that my opponent using good enough? These are the things that you want to keep in mind. These are the things that you want to consider. So first, the sufficiency of evidence. When you're looking at creating an argument, when you're looking at structuring an argument, or you're looking at somebody else's structure of an argument, you need to consider how much evidence do you actually need to prove your point. Are we relying mostly on logos? Are we relying mostly on ethos? Are we relying on testimonials? Are we relying on uh, expert opinions? I mean, what are we relying on and how much do we need? Well, I find that the answer to that question is completely dependent on the claim that you're making. See, the more controversial your claim, the more evidence you're going to need to back up what you're saying. So, for example, if I wanted to prove to you that the earth is flat, well, that's not something that most people agree with. So, I'm going to need to use a lot of evidence to prove my case. If, however, I want to say that LeBron James is the best basketball player of this generation, I probably won't need that much evidence to prove that claim. Or maybe I want to say Tom Brady is the greatest quarterback of all time. I'm not going to need a lot of evidence to prove that claim because a lot of people already agree with that. The more skeptical your audience, the more evidence you're going to need. If you're arguing um, with a conspiracy theorist, first of all, good luck to you. But if you're arguing with a conspiracy theorist, you're going to need a lot of evidence to prove your case. Okay. And even then, it might not be enough. But as this slide points out, please be careful that you don't overload your argument and use too much logos or too much ethos. Remember, when you're using the appeals, that you want to try to reach a balance of ethos, pathos, and logos. Okay, you want that perfect equilateral triangle. So too much ethos or too much logos is going to bore your audience to death too. So just keep that in mind, the sufficiency of evidence. The next thing to keep in mind is the typicality of the evidence. In other words, is the evidence I'm using the exception or is it the norm? Let's look at anti-vaxxers, for example. On the one hand, you have thousands of articles that declare vaccines to be safe. On the other hand, You have one particular article that a lot of anti-vaxxers point to that claims that vaccines cause autism. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is that one article, should that be considered the norm, or should that be considered the exception? So, if you have a certain medicine that claims to be 99% effective, and that 1% it doesn't work, do you declare that 1% to be the fluke or the norm? That's up to you to figure out. But the evidence that you're using, when you're trying to convince somebody, they need to feel like the evidence that you're using is not just the 1 in a million example that proves your side. They need to feel like the evidence that you're using is pretty typical of what they're going to find if they do their own research. So if what I'm saying is if I have a claim, if I have a position on a topic, and I have to dig and dig and dig, and I'm on like page 12 of Google before I even come across one article or one website that agrees with me, and the other 11 pages of Google all disagree with me, maybe I need to reevaluate my position on the topic, because maybe what I'm thinking or my position isn't correct. And that's because the typicality of evidence, the evidence doesn't typically side in my favor. If, however, I get on Google, for example, and there are pages and pages and pages supporting my side, then maybe I'm onto something. The accuracy of evidence. Now, we are going to touch on this a lot later because this is a huge one. Your evidence needs to be accurate to the best of its ability, and it needs to be from a trusted source. Now, this is a huge contention these days with everyone distrusting the other side, and people shouting that this side is fake or that side is fake or this news is fake, that news is fake, whatever. This is an issue these days, and we're going to spend an entire unit talking about how do you tell if the information is fake or not. So more on this later, but consider the accuracy of your evidence as part of your ethos. If you are using shady evidence, if you are using evidence from a shady or shifty source, or a source that doesn't have a good reputation, that affects you as the writer. If I'm using shifty evidence, if I'm a car maker and I get all of my car parts from sources or from companies that are known to have shady dealings and create faulty parts on purpose to save a few dollars, what does that say about me as a car dealer? What does that say about me as a car maker? Are you, the consumer, the customer, going to trust me because of the people that I deal with? It's the same thing you see in the news all the time about certain politicians getting in trouble for the people that they hang out with, or the groups that they associate with, or the groups that they do or don't denounce. So, there you go. Your ethos plays a part in the accuracy of your evidence. For example, let's say that I am arguing with somebody who is extremely conservative. It's going to be a waste of my time to use sources from left-leaning news organizations, because the person on the right is not going to trust those to begin with. And since they don't trust my sources, they, in extension, don't trust me. It's the same thing on the other side. If I'm arguing with somebody on the left, I'm not going to use a far right-leaning news source to back up my claims, because the person on the left is not going to trust those. And by extension, they won't trust me. So if I'm arguing with somebody on the left, I want to use sources that I know that are accurate, but also that my opponent will trust. It's the same thing if I'm arguing with somebody on the right. I'm going to use sources that I know that they will trust, but also are accurate to the best of my knowledge. And then last but not least, the relevancy of your evidence. Now, if I have a really good, really awesome piece of evidence, piece of material, a website or something that really supports my claim, but it's 15 years old, is that a problem? That depends entirely on the topic that you're talking about. If we're talking about technology or medicine, then yeah, a 15-year-old piece of news is ancient, especially in technology, where technology changes like every few months. You know, that's not going to be any good. It's not going to be relevant anymore. If my topic is historical in nature, like if I'm talking about World War II and I find a 15-year-old article about Hitler, well, then it's probably still good because any other news about Hitler would have already been uncovered decades ago. So that's probably still good. It depends on your topic as to how relevant or how current your evidence needs to be. So what kind of evidence can you find? You can use personal experience, but okay, so let me briefly go quickly through these. So personal experience, pros. Um, it's eyewitness account. It's account of people that were actually there. Cons, eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable, plus could be biased. Observations or field research. Pros, again, eyewitness account. I was there. I experienced it. I witnessed it. I saw it with my own eyes. Cons, again, I could be biased. I could have my own agenda. Interviews and surveys are notorious for not asking the right questions or not asking the right people. If you have a survey that asks 1,000 people who they want to vote for in the next election, but you learn that all 1,000 of those people are from the same city, well, is that really a valid survey? Those people probably all vote the same general way anyway. So, interviews can be great or can be bad. If I find an interview for a certain celebrity from a certain other person, but I learn that that person idolizes that celebrity, well, then they probably threw that celebrity some softball questions, some easy questions that really didn't dig into the heart of the issue. So, can I really trust it? Internet research can be good and bad. We'll get into that later, but the internet is the world's knowledge at your fingertips, but there's a lot out there that's fake and meant to trick you. Statistics. Let's talk about statistics real quick. So statistics can be a double-edged sword. They can be great, but at the same time, they can also be framed to say whatever it is that the person wants them to say. And we'll get into that in just a minute. Okay, so framing evidence. Let's say I have some evidence here. And let's say I want to say, like, my claim is that the majority of students in high schools do drugs. Okay. Let's say that I interviewed 4 kids. Okay. And I asked them, do you do drugs of any sort? And of course, they all say no, right? One of them, I get to admit that that person is taking prescription drugs, stuff that their doctor prescribed them. Well, I count that in my survey and I say 25%, because that's 1 out of 4, 25% of students admit to doing drugs. Well, is that an accurate representation of the facts? No. And in fact, is 4 students a large enough sample size to really get a good representation of students across the United States? Not even close. So, how do you get away from people distrusting your evidence? you want to have a decent spread of evidence that supports you and evidence that disagrees with you. Why do you even want to have evidence that disagrees with you? Because you want to have evidence that you can disprove. If I can show you, here's a bunch of sources that agree with me, and I can also show you, here's some sources that disagree with me, and then I attack those sources with even more evidence that agrees with me, then that makes my side even stronger. I can be like, look, here's everybody that agrees with me, here's somebody who disagrees, and here's why they're wrong based on some more evidence. That just makes me look even smarter. Something that people do that's kind of shady as well is emphasizing pathos over facts. Everybody's got a sob story. And if you have a sob story, I empathize with you, and I'm sorry that you have that. But when we're dealing with argumentation, when we're dealing with things that require fact-based evidence, your sob story doesn't disprove or prove a certain side. What I mean by that is just because you knew a guy who this happened to doesn't mean that this is the norm or that that's going to happen to everybody. Just because you knew a guy who went 80 years smoking 20 packs a day doesn't mean that cigarettes aren't bad for you. Okay? Just because you knew somebody who got sick from COVID and then made a completely 100% recovery doesn't mean that COVID isn't dangerous. Okay? This is the idea of using personal anecdotes versus facts. Personal anecdotes don't qualify as facts. You want to always provide context and comments with data. You want to choose sources that you think your opponent is going to trust. So sometimes you'll see a name pop out that's really famous and you're like, ooh, got to use that person. Well, yeah, that's a good idea. But don't just name drop just because. If that person doesn't have anything relevant to say about that topic, then just dropping their name isn't doing any good. Okay. And again, using pathos is not a good idea as your only means of argumentation. Using pathos is a great idea, don't get me wrong. Using pathos as your only means of argumentation to prove your side is shallow. It makes your argument hollow. Okay. You can have emotionally charged images or description in your argument that really help drive the point home. But if that's all you've got, then do you really have much of an argument to stand on? Or are you just going for shock value? And then last but not least, and again, we'll talk more about this later, but framing statistics. Did you know that 57% of all statistics are made up on the spot? Well, guess what? I just made that up. But it sounded good, right? Well, statistics can be made to prove or disprove almost anything, which is why just having logos by itself isn't an effective argument. Let me give you an example, and this is one that happened years ago. Okay, back when President Obama was running for office, I believe this was 2008. Okay, the first time he ran for office. He had a rally in a stadium, a football stadium. And at the time, it was the largest rally for a presidential hopeful in history. He had something like 20 to 25,000 people show up to this rally, which was record numbers at the time. Great amount of people. The stadium held about 90,000 seats. So, yes, it's true that he had a record number of people, but it's also true that 3/4 of those seats remained empty. So, as you can imagine, all the left-leaning sites had cameras focused down at the crowds and in amongst the people, just showing the huge crowd of people. And the headlines were all about record number of people, blah, 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 and what a success, and blah, blah, blah. The conservative sites had all of their cameras, all of their lenses pointed up at the empty stands, and the headlines were basically, what a terrible turnout, what a waste, can't even fill up half a stadium. So where's the truth? Well, the truth is actually in the middle there. Yes, it's true that he had a record turnout. Yes, it's also true that he didn't even fill up half the stadium. But depending on the bias and depending on the agenda of the person making the argument, those statistics were framed in a certain way to make their case stronger. So you always have to be careful when looking at logos and don't just take numbers at face value. Remember, in my example about the students, if I said, if I interviewed 4 kids and I asked them if they'd ever done anything illegal, and 3 out of the 4 kids said yes, and one said no, and I put in my headline, 75% of students admit to doing something illegal before graduation. I mean, technically I'm right, 75%, that 3 out of 4 is 75%. But look at my numbers. I only interviewed 4 kids, and I didn't specify what illegal activity I was talking about. So I was framing my statistics in a way to make my story seem better. You always have to be careful about that. I mean, think about every time you see a commercial and it says like 9 out of 10 doctors agree, or, whatever. We had an example in class about the Claritin commercial, and it said Claritin was the only medicine clinically proven to alleviate your worst symptoms. And then down at the bottom in tiny little lettering, it said it was the only one they tested. They were framing their statistic, they were framing their evidence. You have to be careful about that. Always look at evidence critically. We're going to practice more on this later.